In this video, I'm going to cover the Indian history from 1857 to 1947. This video is the second part of modern history. It is basically a crash course. All the events will be covered in a chronological manner and will be turned into a beautiful timeline. I'll show you how the events are interconnected, and in the end it's going to be a nice, fun, informative session. By the way, there is a part 1 of this video. In case you haven't watched it, I'll put the link of that video in the description. Alright then, let's begin. The previous part ended till 1857. We're going to pick up from there. So 1857 is regarded as an important year in the history of the Indian subcontinent. The revolt of 1857 saw the end of the East India Company's rule in India. If I have to divide the modern history of India, from 1600 to 1857, the Indian subcontinent was ruled by a trading company called the East India Company. After 1857 till 1947, the Indian subcontinent came under the direct rule of the British Crown. In other words, the British government and its parliament transferred the control of British India and its princely states from the mercantile East India Company to the British Crown. We also refer to this period as the actual British Raj. There is another reason why 1857 is regarded as an important year in the history of the Indian subcontinent. It is because of the revolt of 1857. Now let me give you the summary of what led to the 1857 revolt. I'll briefly give you an overview, otherwise this will be a never-ending video. There were multiple reasons behind it. The British East India Company started interfering with India's political, social, religious and financial systems. If you look at the period 1757 to 1800, the British East India Company gradually increased its political and military activities. They had established themselves as one of the major political and military powers by defeating many Mughal and Maratha rulers. Basically, they snatched authority one by one from Muslim and Maratha rulers. They had gained enough confidence in the Indian subcontinent to establish its authority. That's how by the end of 18th century, the British felt very strong and pursued an aggressive policy of territorial expansion. And then after 1800, the British introduced the idea of paramountcy and created laws and institutions which simply meant that the authority and position of the East India Company was supreme in Indian subcontinent. The company introduced many regulations that made many Indians upset with the company's rule. Many Indians saw it as an exploitation of the Indian culture. Some of the laws that made the Indians upset were abolition of sati in 1829, introduction of English education in 1835, spreading of Christianity through missionaries in many rural areas, then doctrine of lapse 1848. The idea behind this was to annex those states which have no successor. Their ruling rights were lapsed. Even in the case of adoption. Due to this law, many princely states like Jhansi, Satara, Udaipur, Jaipur, Sambalpur, Nagpur, etc. became the victims of this policy. Apart from it, the doctrine of lapse was also designed by the British to take away the titles and pensions of the rulers of some states. Now this led to great resentment amongst the rulers. The rulers of these kingdoms thus rose in revolt against the company. Then the British also changed the Hindu law of property by passing the Religious Disabilities Act of 1850. As per this law, it allowed Hindus who converted from Hindu religion to another religion to inherit their ancestral property. Now this law caused a lot of chaos because it was seen as an incentive to give up one's own faith. Then Hindu Widow Remarriage Act of 1856 was passed. Then again in 1856, General Service Enlistment Act was passed. As per this law, the Indian soldiers were required to serve in area away from their homes without any extra allowances, which is called bhatta. It was a taboo for Brahmins in those days to cross the seas. It was known as Samudra Alangana. Even this situation became part of the revolt. Then Indian soldiers were paid low salaries as compared to Britishers of the same rank. Although Indian soldiers outnumbered the British soldiers, but they could not rise above the rank of Subedar and were also racially insulted. The British policy of economically exploiting India also became one of the causes of the revolt. This hurt all sections of the society. Peasants suffered due to high revenue demands and district revenue collection policy. And finally, on 26th February 1857, the 19th Bengal Native Infantry Regiment showed resentment over the new Enfield rifles. You all know the story of the Enfield rifle. Indian soldiers were given the Enfield rifle. The cartridge of the rifle was greased with fat of cow and pig, and that was against their religious faith. They were forced to chew the cartridges during training. Hindu as well as Muslim soldiers took it as a great insult to their religion. Mangal Pandey was the central character of this story. He shot the first bullet at the British. And the last point is when the mutiny started, the Indian troops went to the last Mughal emperor for becoming their leader. The British disrespected the last Mughal emperor Bahadur Shah Zafar, and that hurt the sentiments of Indians, especially Muslims who had great respect for him. So together all of this became the main causes for the uprising of 1857 revolt. On 10th May 1857, in the town of Meerut, a mutiny erupted among the Indian troops of the East India Company's army. Next day, that is on 11th May 1857, early morning, the Indian troops reached Delhi and asked Bahadur Shah Zafar to lead them. Here are the names of the Indian leaders who are associated with the revolt of 1857. Although the mutiny began in Meerut, but it spread rapidly to other places like Delhi, Agra, Kanpur, Bareilly, Gwalior, Jhansi and Lucknow, basically all over present-day Haryana, Bihar, the central provinces and the United Provinces, which is Uttar Pradesh. Now this mutiny, or you can say rebellion, was a severe threat to the British power, because nothing of this magnitude ever happened before. But then the British controlled it in Gwalior on 28th June 1858. That means this revolt went on for 1 to 1.5 years. Now I need to give you the reasons also why the British were able to control the revolt and defeat the rebels. The first reason is that the sepoys who revolted did not have one clear leader. As you saw the list, there were many of them. If you have so many leaders, it's difficult to formulate one single plan. They did not have a proper plan. So overall there was a lack of leadership. That's the first reason. And secondly, there were many princely states who supported the British side by providing soldiers as backup. In other words, our own people, many of them supported the British in fighting and suppressing the rebellions. There were 21 princely states. Here are the names of the princely states that supported the British during the 1857 revolt. Again, the British had told them many stories or gave them many deals to keep them on their side. It is said that many of these princely states were not happy with the fact that the rebels or the Indian troops or sepoys went to Bahadur Shah Zafar for guidance. Many of these princely states saw this revolt from a different lens. They saw it as a restoration attempt of Mughal rule in North India, because they had been persecuted heavily by the Mughal dynasty before the British arrived. Anyhow, the revolt of 1857 continued for 1.5 years, and it forced the British government to rethink and replan its ruling policies in India. That is how on August 2nd, 1858, the British Parliament passed the Government of India Act 1858. Under this act, the East India Company was formally dissolved, and its ruling powers over British territories in India came to an end and were transferred to the British Crown. In other words, from here on, the era of the new British Raj started. During this time, the Governor-General and Viceroy of India was Viscount Canning or Lord Canning. The term Viceroy came from the Government of India Act 1858. So basically it changed the name from the Governor-General of India to Viceroy. The post of Governor-General of India was created by passing the Charter Act of 1833, and that is how Lord William Bentinck became the first Governor-General of India. Before 1833, there was only a Governor of Bengal Presidency. He was also called the Governor-General of Bengal, because the ruling journey of the British in the Indian subcontinent started from the Bengal region. So William Bentinck became the first Governor-General of India after 1833, and after 1858, that is passing of the Government of India Act 1858, Viscount Canning or Lord Canning became the first Viceroy of India. And again, just to be clear, you can call Viceroy or Governor-General, it's the same. Anyhow, if you read the provisions of the Government of India Act 1858, if I have to summarize it in simple words, the 1857 Revolt of Independence shook the British Empire. So the Government of India Act 1858 was a policy designed by the British to basically calm the Indian people and making them believe that forget whatever that happened, East India Company is gone, let's have a fresh start. Indirectly, the British government is saying to the Indian people that they will have their rights and their grievances will be now heard directly by Queen Victoria through this act. It was basically a strategy by the British government to restructure their ruling plans. Again, if you look at the provisions of the act, 1. It ended the doctrine of lapse. 2. It had provisions for creating the Indian civil services for the administration of the country. It also included that Indians will be admitted into the service. Then the Act also had a provision that gave independent status to the remaining Indian princes and chiefs. There were more than 560 in number, only if they accept British rule. And the rest provisions were all British administrative orders. So basically, through the Government of India Act 1858, the British made an attempt to do some damage control. Another thing that I have to point out is that in the 1857 revolt, both the Hindus and Muslims jointly fought against the British. And I want you to understand the depth of this point. Because the British government realized it. You know what they realized? They realized that if the Indian society shared a common feeling, then it is going to be the end of their rule. The British knew that they had to keep the Indians busy with their internal problems, so they could rule the country without any distraction. Otherwise, there was a possibility that such a revolt could have occurred again, and that is when the British adopted the policy of divide and rule. So basically, the British wanted to look good in front of the Indian people by partially adopting modern principles of liberty, equality and justice, so that the Indian people support the colonial modernization. But at the same time, the British were also encouraging casteism and communalism by adopting the policy of divide and rule. Now, how did the British achieve Indian people's support for colonial modernization? Well, they started fulfilling the aspiration of associating Indians into the law-making system. On 1st August 1861, the British created the Indian Council Act of 1861. So today what you know as the Parliament, it actually started as the Governor General's Council in 1861. This whole idea of forming a Governor General's Council first came into effect through the Regulating Act of 1773. At that time, there was Governor General of Bengal. He was assisted by additional 4 people. Collectively, they were known as the Governor General's Executive Council. And then through the Charter Act of 1853, you can see a gradual increase in the membership of the council. What started with 4 people assisting the Governor General, by 1853, it increased to 10 people assisting the Governor General. And the reason was obvious, because the British rule was expanding. And then after 1857 revolt, as I said, the British restructured their administration plans. That is how they came up with the new idea of bringing out the Government of India Act 1858. Anyhow, the British created the Indian Council Act of 1861 just to fulfill the aspiration of the Indians and making them believe that they will be part of the country's law-making process and give them a taste of liberty, equality and justice. After 1861, the council was called Imperial Legislative Council or Indian Legislative Council. It was this act that sowed the seed for the future Legislative Council for India after independence. As per the Indian Councils Act of 1861, the Viceroy had the power to nominate minimum 6 and maximum 12 non-official members who would be holding the office for 2 years. So previously, if the Governor General's Council had 6 members, after 1861, apart from those 6 members, additional 6 to 12 non-official members were invited. And by the way, they were called non-official members. These non-official memberships will include Indian people. That means any of their opinions, decisions meant nothing. It was just for namesake. Now connect this point with what I said. After 1858, the British were trying to connect with the Indian people by opening up the doors for the Indians to be part of the law-making process. But it was just for namesake. Lord Canning nominated 3 Indians to his Legislative Council, the Raja of Banaras, the Maharaja of Patiala and Sir Dinkar Rao in 1862. Even here you can sense that the British appointed only those people as members who had friendly relations with the British Empire. In other words, who did not participate in the revolt of 1857. If you remember, in the beginning I said there were few princely states who were given the gun salute status by the British Empire. Those princely states were in good relations with the British Empire. So Lord Canning nominated members only from those places to his Legislative Council, because he knew these princely states had some loyalty and they were in friendly terms with the British Empire. By the way, there was a revolt in Bengal in 1859 called the Indigo Revolt of Bengal. Indigo was a commercially profitable plant that had a huge demand in the European market. It was first introduced in the Indian subcontinent by a French trader, Louis Bonnat, in 1777. It was introduced in large parts of today's West Bengal and Bangladesh. The British forced the peasants to plant indigo instead of food crops. On top of that, the farmers were paid very low and they were not able to make any profit growing indigo. Together, the British government officials and the Indian zamindars oppressed the farmers, and that led to the Indigo Revolt in 1859. Compared to the 1857 revolt, this Indigo Revolt was a success. On top of it, it was a non-violent revolt. The revolt had a strong effect on the government, which immediately appointed the Indigo Mission in 1860. And if you read the summary of the Commission's report, although it was acknowledged that indigo cultivation was associated with various kinds of oppression, but the British government did not do anything about it in terms of enacting any law. However, they did appoint honest police force and competent magistrates to ensure justice in the rural areas. The intensity of the movement and the fear of not letting it repeat, like the 1857 revolt, the British slowly phased out the indigo cultivation in Bengal. Now this incident again points out to the mindset of the British. After 1857, they totally restructured their idea of ruling. And by the way, this indigo revolt later became a foundation of Gandhiji's non-violent satyagraha. In 1860, the Indian Penal Code was enacted. Although it came into force in 1862, but it was recommended in the First Law Commission of India, which was established in 1834. This is another evidence that points out towards the fact that after 1857 revolt, the British had created this notion of liberty, equality and justice so that the Indian people support the colonial modernization. The Indian Penal Code did not apply to the princely states because they had their own courts and legal systems until the 1940s. As we know, the IPC came into force in Jammu and Kashmir on 31st October 2019, which replaced the state's Ranbir Penal Code. Just remember, the IPC was rolled out during the tenure of Viceroy Lord Canning, but it was prepared and drafted during the tenure of Governor General William Bentinck in 1834. Then in 1861, the Archaeological Survey of India was founded. It was founded by Alexander Cunningham, who also became its first Director General. This also happened under the tenure of Viceroy Lord Canning. The idea behind the establishment of this institution was to conduct research about the Indian subcontinent's history. It is also said that the Colonial Archaeological Survey of India wanted to learn about the history, tradition, culture of the Indian subcontinent in order to strengthen its administration over the subcontinent. As a matter of fact, many violent disagreements between Hindu and Muslim population and the famous Aryan invasion theory, which was debunked, all of it came from the studies and analysis of the monuments, scripts and translation of traditional literature done by the Colonial Archaeological Survey of India. So on one side, we know the importance of ASI, what role it played in research and the conservation and preservation of cultural monuments in the country. And on the other side, the colonial ASI's primary goal was to learn about the history, tradition, culture of the Indian subcontinent, purely intended to strengthen its administration over the subcontinent. Long before the ASI, the British had founded the Asiatic Society of Bengal in 1784. It was founded by William Jones. Its initial goal was to learn about the importance of Hindu culture and learning about the vital role of Sanskrit in the Aryan languages. Then later on in 1829, the British commissioned Maulanas and Pandits to translate important historical, religious and judicial works into English. Among the first books to be translated was the Bhagavad Gita, the Laws of Gentus, Muslim law and so on. Lord Canning retired on 21st March 1862. By the way, during his tenure, 3 universities in India were established: the University of Calcutta, University of Madras and University of Bombay, all in the same year 1857. So he's regarded as the person who stabilized the situation for the British during its transition from the East India Company to the British Raj. Moreover, after the revolt of 1857, his contribution to the British Empire was to restore and replan the British Empire's ruling strategy in the Indian subcontinent. I'm going to consolidate all the administrative changes that the British brought after the 1857 revolt. Have a look at it so that you can understand what the intention of the British was after the 1857 revolt. By the way, you can also see that the Indian Army was also carefully reorganized after the 1857 revolt. I'm calling it as Indian Army, you can also call it as British Indian Army, it's the same. It was because of the 1857 mutiny, the British introduced caste-based induction in the army. It is a well-documented fact that the British intent was to divide the army into martial and non-martial races, wherein they defined non-martial as a class who did not have the qualities to make good leaders. Since the mutiny started from east and south, it was natural for the British to strike them off from roles in the army. It was the north which got rewarded for its martial heritage and the tradition of contribution to the military service. In fact, before 1857, the British used to recruit people into the army from the Bengal as well as Madras Presidency. But after the revolt, the British changed the center of recruitment to North India. And this went on till 1867. Even in terms of organizing the tax system and maintaining social order, after the revolt of 1857, the British rulers categorized the Indian society in a rigid way. Since they did not know which social category to use in order to describe and register Indian society, they started from the Varna system. But the British soon realized that these categories did not work. The Indian society is much diverse and complicated in terms of various social groups and how they perceive themselves. People used jatis, not varnas. Proper census began in 1865. By 1872, the British authorities concluded the first All India census. If you look at the 1871 census, it included caste, religion, profession and age. Some 3,208 jatis were counted. Then in 1881 census, British discovered 19,044 jatis, and there were sub-jatis. Now I want you to imagine a situation where you are an Indian ruler who takes over Europe in the 18th to 19th century and attempts to put the population of the Europe into boxes like carpenters from France, nannies from Britain, Catalan grape pickers, Scottish shepherds, Finnish fishermen, etc. It's going to be complicated, right? The British colonial administrators had no idea on how to classify these thousands of local jatis into broad meaningful categories. So what they did was they used a category which was used in Europe during the 16th to 19th century, the Victorian bourgeois and the working class, or in other parts of the Europe it was known as clergy and nobility. So from 1871 to 1931, in the colonial census, you will see that the British administrators attempt to classify dozens of jatis into one unified category of Brahmins, Kshatriyas and Vaishyas. If you use these definitions, you will find that the weight of Brahmins and Kshatriyas in India from 1871 to 1931 was comparable to the weight of the clergy and nobility in 16th to 19th century Europe. So you see, after 1857, the British government wanted to look good in front of the Indian people by passing acts and laws that reflected modern principles of liberty, equality and justice, so that the Indian people support the colonial modernization. But at the same time, the British were also encouraging casteism and communalism by adopting the policy of divide and rule. Now let me summarize the social atmosphere of the period from 1857 to 1870. If you remember, because of the Government of India Act 1857, the British had opened up the administration positions of the country for Indian people. Now most positions were taken up by the Hindus, and I will tell you why. Initially, when the British came to India as a trading company, they basically snatched the authority from the Mughal rulers. And then after 1800, the British introduced the idea of paramountcy and created many laws and institutions to civilize the Indian society. One of them was introduction of English education through the English Education Act 1835 by Governor General Lord William Bentinck and Thomas Macaulay. Since the British initially took away the authority from the Mughal rulers, they were more inclined towards the Hindu community. That's how they encouraged Hindus and Brahmins to opt for modern education. And you see, even the British needed it, because as the British rule was expanding, it was difficult for them to import enough English men to rule the country. The British needed large number of people in subordinate and lower posts of the administration. At that time, for the British, the Hindus were the advantageous community, and also the fact that the Brahmins were natural learners and pursuers of knowledge. They were quick and far ahead of other communities in terms of grasping information. And then there was also poverty among Brahmins. So overall, it compelled them to opt for lower administrative jobs. So that is how, after passing the Government of India Act 1857, most administrative positions were taken up by the Hindus. Now the British government noticed the Brahmin dominance in the civil service after 1860. And also remember that during the revolt of 1857, both Hindus and Muslims were united in the purpose to defeat the British. And I've told you that the British noticed this unity. So the British had that anger inside them, which translated into oppressing the Muslim community till 1870. Now pay attention to this fact that till 1870, the modern education culture did not spread to the Muslim community. It was only in 1875 Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental College was founded, which was the first modern institution of higher education for Muslims in India at that time. It was founded by Sir Syed Ahmad Khan. So basically after 1870, the British started favoring the Muslim community. So after 1870, the British started favoring the Muslim community, and after 1857 revolt, the British divided the Hindu community on the basis of rigid caste system, which is evident from the 1871 census, and restructuring of the Indian army on the basis of martial and non-martial races. So all of this together made the Indians aware of the British intentions. The British were clearly exercising control over the resources of India and the lives of its people. As a result of that, the actual political uprising in India during the British rule first began in 1870s and 1880s. Groups like Pune Sarvajanik Sabha, the Indian Association, the Madras Mahajan Sabha, the Bombay Presidency Association, and of course the Indian National Congress started emerging. Always remember this point. In India, social reforms came first before any nationalist movement or any political reform. All these groups that I'm talking about, these are political groups, but they started off with social reforms. That's why they are also called as socio-political organizations. So actual political uprising in India for the first time under the British rule began after 1870s and 1880s. The late 19th and early 20th centuries witnessed the rise of nationalism not just in India, but in many Afro-Asian countries. In India, the most important political group, which went on to become the widespread political party of that time, was the Indian National Congress. It was formed in 1885. If you look at the names of these early political groups that emerged after 1870, one thing that you will realize is that these groups were made up mainly of people from the Hindu, Parsi and Christian communities, because they slowly realized the intention of the British. For British, they viewed these political groups as a rise of nationalism that could threaten the British power in India. The British feared that this would lead to a repeat of 1857 revolt. Now, an important feature of the nationalist movement was that it took longer to spread among the Muslim community. As I've mentioned, it was only in 1875 Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental College was founded, which was the first modern institution of higher education for Muslims in India at that time. It was founded by Sir Syed Ahmad Khan. The British noticed the absence of the Muslims in this movement and quickly began working on ensuring that they did not join the movement. The British then began implementing policies that promoted the activities of communal forces and divided the national struggle, about which we will learn as we move ahead. Anyhow, the Indian National Congress was formed in 1885. At that time, the Governor General and the Viceroy of India was Lord Dufferin. You have to understand this. Under his command, if any nationalist movement is emerging, then obviously we have to assume that the British government were aware of it. If at all they saw it as a threat, they could have easily silenced it. Or there might be another reason behind it. Maybe the British wanted to gain support from all communities in India. That is why they did not bother striking down all these political groups that emerged after 1870. So again, try and relate this to what I said in the beginning. After 1857, the British were trying to do everything to impress the Indians into accepting modern colonialism. So on one hand, the British had the doubts and fear of these social groups turning into a massive political groups that would kickstart any sort of nationalist movement. And on the other hand, the British viewed these social groups as a gateway that would help the British to gain support from all communities in India. At least it would create an illusion among the people of India that their interests are being heard by the British through these social groups. In fact, one of the founding members of the Indian National Congress was a British civil servant named Alan Octavian Hume. A British guy is a founding member of an Indian political party. That means it is right when I said the British government allowed these political groups to emerge simply because they wanted to gain substantial support from all communities in India. The Indian National Congress during its initial phase, that is in its first 20 years, it was dominated by politicians with moderate political views. Initially, their aim was not to demand independence from the British. Since Indians were already given the opportunity to be part of Imperial Civil Services through the Government of India Act 1858, however, being part of the Imperial Civil Services, Indians were only taking orders from the British government, and they were only involved in the implementation process. With the formation of Indian National Congress in 1885, Indians got the opportunity to have political discourse and influence policy making. That means in the initial phase, the members of the Indian National Congress were using methods like petition, prayers, meetings, leaflets and delegations to present their demands in front of the British government. One of the things that they were able to achieve was the expansion of the Legislative Council by the Indian Council Act of 1892. Due to the excessive demand of the Indian National Congress, the additional members were increased. If you remember, as per the Indian Council Act of 1861, the Viceroy had the power to nominate minimum 6 and maximum 12 non-official members in the legislature, who would be holding the office for 2 years. Now through the Indian Council Act of 1892, the minimum members were increased from 6 to 10 and the maximum members were increased from 12 to 16. And by the way, these were the major demands placed by the Indian National Congress in front of the British government during its first session of 1885 to 1889. Most of them were rejected, but if you can see, one of the demands of the Congress was that the non-official members were to be elected in place of nomination. If you can recollect, after the 1861 Indian Council Act, Lord Canning nominated 3 Indians to his Legislative Council, the Raja of Banaras, the Maharaj of Patiala and Sir Dinkar Rao in 1862. Now these were nominated. The purpose behind that was simple. The British appointed only those people as members who had friendly relations with the British Empire. In other words, who did not participate in the revolt of 1857. So keeping this in mind, one of the demands of the Congress was that the non-official members were to be elected in place of nomination. The British were not in favor of this demand. So what the British did was, through the Indian Council Act of 1892, they gave limited provision in filling up some of the non-official seats in the central and provincial legislative councils on the recommendation of certain bodies. In other words, the British saturated the election process and extended it to more bodies in an attempt to hide their direct influence. So the initial members of the Indian National Congress with moderate political view were not able to achieve notable goals other than the expansion of the Legislative Council through the Indian Council Act of 1892. Now this created dissatisfaction among the general public. See, you have to understand this. At that time, the Indian National Congress consisted only of middle-class educated elites. The general public of India did not fully connect with them. In fact, after 1892, many Indians began to raise questions about the political style of the Congress. Even some of the party members started opposing the party's moderate attitude, especially towards the fight for self-government. With time, the Indian National Congress started facing constant opposition from the British government on every policy, plan or proposal that the party had put forward, due to which the members of the Congress party started having opposing views. In other words, from moderate political views, some party members started adopting radical views, which were inclined towards the independence movement. So as I said, the Indian National Congress in its first 20 years had members with moderate political views, and the party was also facing constant opposition from the British government on every policy, plan and proposal that the party had put forward, and this created dissatisfaction among the general public. With time, the Congress party became more radical and in favor of the independence movement. In other words, by the beginning of the 20th century, Congress demands became more radical. Finally, the Indian National Congress split into 2 parts, that is moderates and extremists, in the year 1907 at the Surat session of Congress, which was also popularly known as Surat Split. Here are the names of some of the moderate leaders and the extremist leaders. Although the Congress split in the year 1907, but I will tell you the reason that led to the split. The Governor General and the Viceroy of India from 1899 to 1905 was Lord Curzon. If you can recollect, I said the actual political uprising in India for the first time under the British rule began after 1870s and 1880s, when these early political groups emerged. and these groups were made up mainly of people from the Hindu, Parsi and Christian communities. The number of Muslims were negligible. And we also know that it was only in 1875 Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental College was founded, which was the first modern institution of higher education for Muslims in India at that time. It was founded by Sir Syed Ahmad Khan. That means the modern education culture did not spread to the Muslim community till the 1870s. So basically till 1870, the British oppressed the Muslims greatly because they were part of the 1857 revolt. After 1870, the British started favouring the Muslim community, while the English education was passed on to the Hindu communities much earlier. As a result, by the end of the 19th century, almost 2 to 3 generations of the Hindus got educated, and they dominated the colonial services and many other administrative posts. That also meant that the early nationalist movements was made up mainly of people from the Hindu, Parsi and Christian communities. The British noticed the absence of the Muslims in this movement, and they quickly began working on ensuring that they did not join the movement. The British then began implementing policies that promoted the activities of communal forces and divided the national struggle. So what the British did was, on 16th October 1905, Viceroy Curzon partitioned Bengal by separating the largely Muslim eastern areas from the largely Hindu western areas. Please remember this date, Bengal Partition of 1905. Because the Bengal Partition is a classic example of British government's divide and rule policy. The main motive of the British was to curtail the influence of Bengali politicians and to split the Bengali people, but in reality it turned out to be a communal split. The partition separated the largely Muslim eastern areas from the largely Hindu western areas. As usual, for the British, the reason for partition was all administrative. Governor General Curzon had stated that the eastern region was neglected and undergoverned, and hence by splitting the province, an improved administration could be established. However, the actual motives behind the partition were different. The British wanted to weaken the position of the Bengali Hindu politicians, since Muslims would now dominate in the east. Now you have to carefully understand two things. First, the Hindus were unhappy with the partition of Bengal, but the Muslims were in favor of it. And the second thing is, in the very same year, in December 1905, the partition of Bengal became the rise of extremism in the Indian National Congress. In other words, there was a split in the Indian National Congress. If you see Congress, which always said that it represents all different communities in India, they failed to attract Muslim leaders to their sessions. And by the way, after partitioning Bengal presidency, on 18th November 1905, Governor General and Viceroy Lord Curzon retired. After him, Lord Minto became the next Governor General and Viceroy. Anyhow, the Congress failed to attract Muslim leaders to their sessions. Many Muslim community leaders viewed the Congress negatively because most of the party members were dominated by Hindus. The founding members of the Congress made many efforts to attract Muslims to their sessions. The majority of the Muslim leadership, such as Sir Syed Ahmad Khan and Syed Amir Ali, rejected the notion that India's two distinct communities could be represented by the Congress. And because of the partition of Bengal, the Muslim upper class and many influential Muslim community leaders met Governor General and Viceroy Lord Minto in Shimla on 1st October 1906, which was called the Shimla Deputation. The aim of the deputation was to win the sympathies of the British Raj on their side concerning matters relating to their interests as a community. And then, within a few months after the Shimla Deputation, on 30th December 1906, the Muslim leaders formed their own national political organization, which came to be known as the Muslim League. The Muslim League was founded on 30th December 1906 in Decca, which is present-day Bangladesh, because majority of the Muslim population at that time lived in that part of the subcontinent, and their aim was to establish a separate Muslim majority state or a nation. Notice, all forms of political uprising during the British rule were initiated and started by rich, upper middle class, elite, educated people, irrespective of their religion. But one thing for sure is that they complicated a lot of things, sometimes out of self-interest and sometimes hiding among the amorphous crowd. Anyhow, since it was the first Muslim political party in the history of India, naturally Muslims of all British Indian provinces found shelter and voice under the mainstream political umbrella of Muslim League. In other words, I want you to remember this point. The partition of Bengal in 1905 was the reason behind the political uprising of the Indian Muslims in securing representation in the government. The main objective behind the creation of Muslim League was to prevent Hindu dominance over Muslims through a parliamentary system by demanding separate electorates. Although the Muslim League was founded in Decca, which is present-day Bangladesh, but the principal organizers and the main supporters of the Muslim League were the Muslims from the Uttar Pradesh region. In fact, the Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental College, which was the first modern institution of higher education for Muslims that was founded by Sir Syed Ahmad Khan in 1875, the place where it was founded is Aligarh, and it is this same college that went on to become the famous Aligarh Muslim University in 1920, where the idea of two-nation theory emerged. Anyhow, after 1906, year after year, the Muslim League in their annual session started preparing agenda, schemes and reforms. One of it was to demand a separate electoral representation in the Imperial Legislative Council of British India. In 1909, the British fulfilled their demand by providing some reserved seats in the Imperial Legislative Council through the Indian Councils Act of 1909. It is also commonly known as the Morley-Minto Reforms. So if you remember, the British created the Indian Council Act of 1861 for fulfilling the aspiration of associating Indians into the law-making system. The Viceroy had the power to nominate minimum 6 and maximum 12 non-official members in the legislature, who would be holding the office for 2 years. And then through the Indian Council Act of 1892, that number increased. And finally, through the Indian Council Act of 1909, the British fulfilled Muslim League's demand by providing some reserved seats in the Imperial Legislative Council. That means the Muslims were given some reserved seats in the Imperial Legislative Council of British India. And this demand kept increasing because the Muslim League wanted more and more seats. The British kept listening and gave more and more representation. So connect this point with what I said earlier, that the British first favored the Hindus and then pleased the Muslims, part of their divide and rule policy. Anyhow, as you can analyze, the Indian Muslims were now in favor of the British. On the other hand, for the British, Muslims were seen as a helpful and possibly loyal counterbalance against the Hindu population. But you also have to understand that the British did not fully trust the Muslim population because of their role in the 1857 revolt and the assassination of Viceroy Lord Mayo in 1872. Lord Mayo was stabbed to death by a Pathan called Sher Ali Afridi. Now, the assassination of a viceroy sent shock waves throughout Britain and British India. Anyhow, while the British saw the Muslims as a loyal counterbalance against the Hindu population, but they did not have full trust in them. One thing I forgot to add is that Muslims were in favor of the Bengal partition, whereas the Hindus were not in favor of it. Now, due to this, the Hindu community showed anger towards the British by launching the Swadeshi movement, by boycotting the British goods. So whenever I say Hindus and Muslims, not all were against each other. When the British created such fault lines between the two communities, there were many from both the communities who were in favor of Hindu-Muslim unity. So please use your sense accordingly and think about the situation. Anyhow, the Swadeshi movement was organized and led by Aurobindo Ghosh, Lokmanya Bal Gangadhar Tilak, Bipin Chandra Pal, Lala Lajpat Rai, V.O. Chidambaram Pillai and Babu Genu. So basically, the Swadeshi movement was started by the extremist leaders of the Indian National Congress as a response to the Bengal partition decision taken by Lord Curzon. The extremist members of the Congress wanted to take this Swadeshi movement from Bengal to all over India with an objective to get Swaraj. Swaraj means self-rule. The extremist members of the Congress started this political struggle in the name of Swadeshi movement to achieve self-governance. But the moderate members of the Congress were not interested in it. This difference between the moderates and extremists regarding their ideology finally led to the split of the Congress in 1907. And as we know, in 1909, the British gave the Muslims some reserved seats in the Imperial Legislative Council of British India. But if you look at the Swadeshi movement, it started in 1905 and went on till 1911. In the year 1911, during the Delhi Darbar, the partition of Bengal was cancelled by the visiting Royal Majesty George V because of the mounting pressure of the Swadeshi movement caused by the Hindus. At this time, the Governor General and Viceroy was Lord Hardinge. The famous Lady Hardinge Medical College in Delhi is named after his wife. Anyhow, the visiting Royal Majesty George V cancelled the partition of Bengal in 1911. At the same time, the king announced to shift the capital of British India from Calcutta to Delhi. When the British cancelled the partition of Bengal, it came as a shock to the Muslim political elite, because if you remember, the Muslims were in favor of the partition of Bengal. Now this made the Indian Muslims angry and made them realize the importance of standing on their feet and not depend too much on the British. That's when the Muslim community realized that they had to organize themselves politically. The Swadeshi movement ended in 1911. Let me also tell you quickly about Muhammad Ali Jinnah. Now Jinnah joined Congress in 1906. Even though Muslim League had been formed, he could have left Congress and joined Muslim League, but he resigned from Congress in 1920. You see, Jinnah was a member of the moderate group in the Congress, favoring the Hindu-Muslim unity. In fact, in 1906, when the delegation of Muslim leaders met Governor General and Viceroy Lord Minto in Shimla on 1st October 1906, which was called the Shimla Deputation, where the aim of the Muslim delegation was to win the sympathies of the British Raj on their side concerning matters relating to their interest as a community, Jinnah was totally against it. In fact, he even wrote a letter to the editor of the Gujarati newspaper asking what right the members of the delegation had to speak for Indian Muslims, as they were unelected and self-appointed. So this proves that Muhammad Ali Jinnah during the partition of Bengal was not a fan of the Muslim League. However, Jinnah had been regularly invited to Muslim League meetings as early as 1910, but he did not join the Muslim League till October 1913 because he did not trust the Muslim elites who dominated the organization. So he joined the Muslim League in 1913, but he remained a member of the Congress as well. Basically, he was playing the bridge between Muslims and Hindus. The Congress party was happy with it because they saw Jinnah as an important contact into the Muslim League. An interesting fact is that he was elected to the Imperial Legislative Council from Bombay Muslim constituency on January 25, 1910. Basically, he got the reserved Muslim seat through the Indian Council Act or the Morley-Minto reforms of 1909. As we know, Jinnah joined the Muslim League in 1913, while remained a member of the moderate wing of the Congress party. He then became the president of Muslim League in December 1916 session in Lucknow. Jinnah was the architect of the 1916 Lucknow Pact between the Congress and the Muslim League. When I say Congress, the meeting at Lucknow marked the reunion of the moderate and radical wings of the Congress. So basically, Jinnah brought everyone from the Congress party and the Muslim League on same page. That is why Jinnah is known as the architect of the 1916 Lucknow Pact. Here are the list of reforms that were agreed by the Indian National Congress and the All India Muslim League. Sarojini Naidu gave Jinnah the title the Ambassador of the Hindu-Muslim Unity. So the whole idea behind the Lucknow Pact was to bring both Congress and Muslim League together on most issues regarding self-government and present themselves as a united front against the British Empire. So that was the whole idea of the 1916 Lucknow Pact. However, the Lucknow Pact only gave the impression of Hindu-Muslim unity in the national political scene. But in reality, it made way for communal politics in India and made both the parties believe that India consisted of two different communities with different interests and made them believe that communalism is part of Indian politics. If you see, the British succeeded in dividing both the communities, so much so that communalism had now entered these political groups, which once upon a time started off as social reforms. Connect this point with what I had said before. If you carefully look at the history, all communal riots began only after 1857, artificially engineered by the British authorities. There were no communal problems in India before 1857. Of course, there were differences between Hindu and Muslims, but there was no animosity. All communal riots and animosity began after 1857. The British government created split in the Indian society in 3 stages. First they favored the Hindus, then was the turn of Muslims, and at last they turned their attention towards the backward classes. I can continue talking about this divide and rule policy, but then we will deviate and this will be a never-ending video. Anyhow, what you need to know is that after 1858, the British government carefully started dissecting the Indian society on communal grounds, and this continued till 1940s. Anyhow, the Lucknow Pact was basically an impression of Hindu-Muslim unity and also marked the reunion of the moderate and radical wings of the Congress. In simple words, all of the Indian National Congress and the Muslim League were together on the same page regarding self-government or home rule. In our entire modern history, you will hear about this Indian Home Rule movement. This is basically an independence movement that lasted for 2 years between 1916 to 1918 under the leadership of Annie Besant and Bal Gangadhar Tilak. Annie Besant became the president of Indian National Congress in 1917. She played an important role in the unification of moderates and radical wings of the Indian National Congress, as well as unity between Muslim League. So this Home Rule movement or self-government idea was an outcome of the Lucknow Pact of 1916. And as we know, the architect of Lucknow Pact was Muhammad Ali Jinnah. Now before the Lucknow Pact, I want to take you 2 years behind, India in 1914. As we all know that the World War I was declared on 28th July 1914. India played a significant part in World War I. However, India's part in the war is frequently overlooked. It was fought between multiple countries by forming allies. Serbia, Russia, France, Britain, Italy and the United States on one side under the title European Allies. They were fighting against Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria and Ottoman Empire, who together formed the Central Powers. It ended with the defeat of the Central Powers. Anyhow, when the war broke out in 1914, India was in a state of growing political unrest. If you remember, in 1911 during the Delhi Darbar, the national capital shifted from Calcutta to India and the Bengal partition was cancelled. The cancellation of Bengal partition made the Muslims angry, and within Congress party, the extremist group were pushing the idea of self-government. Even the Muslim League was politically organizing itself because they realized after 1911 that they cannot fully depend on the British. So that is how when the World War I broke out in 1914, India was in a state of growing political unrest. Now there were many people in India who had the opinion that if Britain got involved in a crisis somewhere, something like a world war, then the Indian extremists would use this as an opportunity to advance the idea of self-government. However, when the war broke out, those educated elites with political influence within India, both from Congress as well as Muslim League, believed that if India supported the British in World War I, then British would reward India with a major move towards independence or at least self-government. So this was the whole idea. But in reality, nothing of that happened. Anyhow, if you have seen the video of Shashi Tharoor, Does Britain Owes Reparations? In that he has given the quantification of how much India spent. I'll just put it on the screen. Rest if you want, you can see that video and learn more about it. Here's the list. These financial and military help were made from all over the country. Many wealthy princely states offered great sums of money, and even areas outside of British India like Nepal and Tibet offered help in providing troops. Such was the cost of the war that India's economy was pushed to near bankruptcy. The World War I went on till November 11th, 1918. As usual, India was expecting that the British would reward with major move towards independence or self-government. The mood of the British was obvious. Nothing of that sort happened, and because of that, the mood in India became more militant. Now let me introduce Gandhi. Gandhi returned to India on January 9th, 1915, after staying for 21 years in South Africa. Now before coming to India, he was already running an organization called Natal Indian Congress in South Africa that aimed to fight discrimination against Indians in South Africa. When he finally arrived in Bombay in 1915, he did not participate in any political movement. The first 2 years, he was basically roaming around India. Actually, he was advised by his mentor, Gopal Krishna Gokhale, who belonged to the moderates group within the Indian National Congress. Gopal Krishna Gokhale died in February 1915, that is 1 month after Gandhi's arrival in India. When Gandhi got the news of Gopal Krishna Gokhale's death, Gandhi took a vow not to wear any footwear for a year. With this, you can imagine Gandhi's relationship with Gokhale. Anyhow, the first political movement led by Gandhi in India was called the Champaran Satyagraha on 17th April 1917. It was a farmers' uprising that took place in Champaran district in Bihar against the indigo cultivators. The British had imposed high taxation on peasants to support World War I. You see, the British were already using our own money to fund their war. And on top of it, the Indian political fraternity were thinking, let's help British in the war and maybe we will be rewarded with self-government. Just imagine the situation. Gandhi used the same methods that he had used in South Africa to organize mass uprisings by people to protest against injustice. Now this movement is also called India's first civil disobedience movement, but it was a peaceful movement. It was not a violent uprising. So whenever any movement is peaceful, immediately think that it was the idea of the moderates of the Indian National Congress, because the extremist groups of the Congress were advocates of violent methods to topple the British colonialists in India. So Gandhi's first movement, that is Champaran Satyagraha in India, was a successful movement. Rajendra Prasad, who later went on to become the first president of India, was part of this movement. He was a lawyer too, so he gelled along well with Gandhi. That's when Gandhi's popularity started increasing, and he was also given the title Bapu. On November 11, 1918, the World War I ended, and as we know, the European allies had defeated the Central Power. That also meant that Britain was part of the winning team. India was expecting a reward from the British. The mood of the British was obvious. Nothing of that sort happened, and that made Indians very angry, and the mood in India became more militant. Now, before the World War I ended, Gandhi organized second Satyagraha movement called the Kheda Satyagraha in Gujarat on 18th February 1918. Even this movement was in support of peasants. As you know, India was wrecked by high taxation and high inflation in supporting the war. Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel was part of this movement too. Even he was a lawyer, and two of them gelled well during the Kheda movement. Even this movement was a peaceful agitation. Now, if you can recollect, the Lucknow Pact of 1916 was actually an agreement between the Indian National Congress and the Muslim League towards forming a united front against the British in demand of self-rule, and the architect was Muhammad Ali Jinnah. Now, Jinnah's problem with the Congress began with the rise of Gandhi in 1918, because that's when the Gandhian era had started. Jinnah was against Gandhi's idea of non-violent civil disobedience movements as the means to obtain Swaraj. Jinnah believed that self-government should be secured through constitutional means. In simple words, both Jinnah and Gandhi's aim was Swaraj, but their ways of obtaining it were different. On top of that, Gandhi was also gaining popularity among the Indian people. He did not wear Western-style clothes. He did his best to use an Indian language instead of English, and was deeply spiritual and religious. See, all these political elites who were part of the political groups, both Congress and Muslim League, they all had political ambitions. They were fully aware of the fact that if they achieve Swaraj through constitutional means, then only they can fulfill their political ambitions. Because the country had to be governed even after getting autonomy. And we all know after independence, these all political elites went on to secure constitutional positions. In today's example, if I have to explain, if you remember Anna Andolan, who ultimately benefited from it? Kejriwal and his Mandli. Anna Hazare disappeared after the movement. Similarly, Jinnah and other political elites had their private political ambitions, because they knew that a country has to be governed even after gaining autonomy. And you all know that all the political movements and social reforms in India were started by educated elites from middle and rich class. So naturally, even if a country gains autonomy, they were the voice, so they had to gain something back, and that is what is their political ambition. Gandhi was just roaming around like a fakir, but his personality and movements were turning out to be successful and he was gaining popularity. Indian people were able to relate with him. That's what bothered Jinnah. In 1918, we know that the World War I came to an end. India was badly let down by the British government, even when India supported them in World War I. Many Indians were angry. The war ended in the month of November. I want you to imagine the year 1918. On one hand, Gandhi's civil disobedience peaceful movements were slowly gaining popularity. And on the other hand, the whole idea of the Congress and the Muslim League supporting the British during the World War so that in return they will get their wishes fulfilled, which did not happen. And one more point is that India was suffering from influenza pandemic. The 1918 Spanish flu was the most devastating in history, and India was the focal point of the pandemic. And not to forget, the regular poverty, disease and suffering all were happening parallelly in the country during these years. When so much was happening, the Indian nationalists did not create any unrest. There were no mutinies against the British. Though political unrest did continue in Punjab and Bengal, but nothing major like a mutiny happened. Now you have to understand this. In the initial phase of the Gandhian era, the British were not that much concerned or scared with Gandhi's non-violent movements because they already were familiar with Gandhi's moves in South Africa. What the British were worried about were the actions of the extremists in India. As I said, India was badly let down by the British government for its part played in World War I. Now the Indian nationalists started demanding Swaraj for their support to the British during World War I. That's when the British government used another clever tactic. They introduced the Government of India Act 1919. It is also called as Montagu-Chelmsford reforms. Try to recollect, a similar strategy was used after 1857 revolt, when the company rule was replaced by the crown rule. To calm Indian people in adopting the new colonial rule, the British introduced Government of India Act 1858 and gave Indians representation in the civil services. Like that, once again a clever tactic was used by introducing Government of India Act 1919. It is also called as Montagu-Chelmsford reforms. You see, every time the British did something, the next thing they would do is damage control by passing reforms and making the Indians believe that their interests are being hurt. Like that, one such reform is the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms. Edwin Montagu was the then Secretary of State for India, and Lord Chelmsford was India's Viceroy between 1916 and 1921. Basically, after the World War I, many Indian leaders believed that Britain would give Swaraj, but the British government had no intention of that. What they did was they introduced some changes in the administrative system. This came to be known as Montagu-Chelmsford Reforms or the Government of India Act 1919. World War I ended in November 1918. The Montagu-Chelmsford Reforms was a report made by Edwin Montagu, the then Secretary of State for India, and Lord Chelmsford, who was India's Viceroy at that time. Now this report was published on 8th July 1918. This report became the basis for the Government of India Act 1919, which was passed on 23rd December 1919. If you look at this act, the British basically separated the central and provincial subjects. However, the structure of government continued to be centralized and unitary. For the first time, the British government transferred power to provincial governments over subjects like education, agriculture, veterinary service, roads and buildings, social welfare, etc. This act introduced one more thing. It extended the principle of communal representation by providing separate electorates for non-Brahmin groups, Sikhs, Indian Christians, Anglo-Indians and Europeans. If you remember Morley-Minto reforms of 1909, it created separate Muslim electorate. That means the principle of dividing population into communal groups, which had been adopted in the Morley-Minto reforms, had been extended even beyond by Montagu-Chelmsford reforms in 1919. Gandhi and Lal Bahadur Shastri criticized this move because they knew that it would create permanent split in Hindu society and perpetuate casteism. If you remember throughout this video, I'm constantly saying this, that the British government created a split in the Indian society in 3 stages. First, they favored the Hindus, then was the turn of Muslims, and at the last, they turned their attention towards the backward classes. Government of India Act 1919 or the Montagu-Chelmsford reform is the point where the British started focusing on the backward classes. That's how they created a split in the Indian society. So these are the three stages of British government's divide and rule policy. As we know, the Indians supported the British in World War I to get Swaraj in return. But we know that did not happen. And the Montagu-Chelmsford report of July 1918 had no mentioning of Swaraj. There was widespread discontent throughout the country. People were angry. The British government adopted new measures to discourage Indians from rising against them by suppressing revolutionary groups and depriving Indians of their right to personal expression and liberty. In March 1919, the Rowlatt Act was passed, which was based on the report of the Rowlatt Commission. It is officially known as the Anarchical and Revolutionary Crimes Act 1919. This law gave the British government the power to arrest any person without any trial. The Imperial Legislative Council passed the infamous Rowlatt Act. Many leaders who were members of the assembly resigned in protest. Gandhi, who had already formed a reputation of forming Satyagraha Sabha by then, called for a countrywide protest. Now throughout the country, 6th April 1919 was observed as a National Humiliation Day. There were demonstrators and hartals all over the country. All business throughout the country came to a standstill. Such a protest of a united people had never been witnessed at any time in India before. The British government resorted to brutal measures to put down the agitation, and there were lathi charges and firings at a number of places. April is also the month of Baisakhi. On 13th April 1919, many villagers gathered in Jallianwala Bagh, which is a public garden in Amritsar, for the celebration of Baisakhi. The gatherers wanted to also peacefully protest the arrest and deportation of two national leaders, Satyapal and Saifuddin Kichliu. They were arrested under the new Rowlatt Act. Anyhow, the villagers were peacefully protesting against the arrest. The situation in Punjab was already alarming, as there were riots and protests against the Rowlatt Act. Punjab was already put under martial law, which meant that it became unlawful for more than 4 people to assemble at a place. The Lieutenant Governor of Punjab at that time was Michael O'Dwyer. Lord Chelmsford was India's Viceroy. Brigadier General Dyer came there with his troops and blocked the only narrow entrance to the garden. Then, without warning, he ordered his troops to fire at the unarmed crowd, which included children as well. Thousands of people were killed. This tragedy came as a shock to Indians, and it totally destroyed Indians' somewhat faith in the British system of justice. So remember this order. World War I ended, then Montagu-Chelmsford report was made. Indians did not like it because we were expecting Swaraj, but the report created more communalism. Because of people's anger, British introduced the Rowlatt Act in 1919. After that, Jallianwala Bagh massacre happened. So remember this pattern. Then on 23rd December 1919, the Government of India Act was passed. The Act embodied the reforms recommended in the Montagu-Chelmsford report. The Indian National Congress rejected the Act. But there were many leaders in the Congress. They accepted the Act and were ready to cooperate with the British government. But these people resigned and formed their own political party. Gandhi, Bal Gangadhar Tilak and Jinnah were not in favor of this Act. For Muhammad Ali Jinnah, it was the right time to leave Congress. As I've said, his idea of gaining Swaraj was through constitutional medium, plus he did not like Gandhi's growing popularity. But the main reason behind his resignation from Congress was that in 1920, the Indian National Congress under the leadership of Gandhi launched a movement of non-cooperation to boycott all aspects of British rule. The aim of this non-cooperation movement was to obtain full independence, as the Indian National Congress withdrew its support for British reforms following the Rowlatt Act and the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. Now within the Congress party, Gandhi started becoming the central figure, because all the influential leaders of the Congress either died or left the party or joined or made other political parties by 1920. Bal Gangadhar Tilak died on 1st August 1920. Gopal Krishna Gokhale died in 1915. Plus, Gandhi's non-violent Satyagraha was in line with the Congress moderate wing. The important leaders of the extremists were Bal Gangadhar Tilak, Bipin Chandrapal and Lala Lajpat Rai. If you remember, the trio were popular as Lal Bal Pal. As I said, Bal Gangadhar Tilak died in 1920. The other two opposed the Gandhian philosophy, but their political career ended by 1920. And if you remember, the Swadeshi movement, which started in 1906 after the Bengal partition, came to an end in 1911 when the Bengal partition was cancelled. And even that Swadeshi movement meant boycotting of British-made goods. And the Home Rule movement started in 1916 after the Lucknow Pact. The architect of Lucknow Pact was Jinnah. But as the decade came to an end, everything shifted towards Gandhian philosophy. That's why the period from 1905 and 1920 is known as the period of the extremists with the Indian National Congress. So that's how by 1920, Gandhi became the central figure of Congress, and Jinnah also started losing his feet in Indian National Congress. Jinnah openly criticized Gandhi, so he resigned after the launch of non-cooperation movement in September 1920. Jinnah was also a member of the Muslim League. After his resignation from Congress in 1920, he was only part of the Muslim League. The non-cooperation movement of 1920 launched by Gandhi was aimed at gaining Swaraj, but it was the Gandhi's version of achieving Swaraj. Gandhi's local style of leadership gained great popularity with the Indian people, and Gandhi became the face of the nation. Now, one more thing that I have to tell you is about the Khilafat movement. It was launched in the month of October-November 1919. The Khilafat movement was launched by the Indian Muslims to express support for the Caliph of Turkey against the Allied powers, particularly Britain. If you remember, World War I was fought between European allies and Central Power. Ottoman Empire were Turkish-speaking Muslim people who were on the side of the Central Powers, and they lost. The territorial boundary of the Ottoman Empire got reduced. After winning the World War I, Great Britain and France went ahead with territorial rearrangements, which dramatically altered the political map of the world, and Europe in particular. The purpose of Khilafat movement in India was to pressure the British government to preserve the authority of the Ottoman Sultan as Caliph of Islam, following the breakup of the Ottoman Empire at the end of the war. From 1876 to 1909, Abdul Hamid II was the Ottoman Emperor. Being a Caliph, the Ottoman Emperor was the supreme religious and political leader of all Sunni Muslims across the world. In India, many Muslim leaders joined hands and created an All India Khilafat Committee at Lucknow in the month of October and November 1919. Many of the Muslim leaders who were part of the Khilafat movement were already active in the Indian nationalist movement since 1914. Many of them were imprisoned during the war because of their pro-Turkish sympathies. Upon their release in 1919, they created the Khilafat movement. As we know, the Indian National Congress, led by Gandhi, started the non-cooperation movement against the British in September 1920. Khilafat movement started a year before. Gandhi also supported the Khilafat movement, as he saw in it the opportunity to rally Muslim support for nationalism. The Indian Muslims in turn supported Gandhi's non-cooperation movement. The combined Khilafat and non-cooperation movement was the first all-India agitation against the British rule. It saw a massive degree of Hindu-Muslim cooperation, which was based on Gandhi's non-violent protest, which is also called Satyagraha. By the end of 1921, the British government suppressed the Khilafat movement. The leaders were arrested and imprisoned, but it still continued till 1924 in small fragments. Gandhi suspended the non-cooperation movement on 12th February 1922. The non-cooperation movement was withdrawn because of the Chauri Chaura incident. It took place at Chauri Chaura in the Gorakhpur district of the United Province in British India on 4th February 1922, when a large group of protesters participating in Gandhi's non-cooperation movement clashed with police who opened fire. As we know, the non-cooperation movement was supposed to be a peaceful and non-violent movement. However, an incident at Chauri Chaura changed the course of the movement. On 5th February, about 2,500 people marched towards the Chauri Chaura market in order to protest in front of a liquor shop. One of their leaders was arrested. A group of people then marched towards the police station, demanding the release of the arrested leader. The police fired shots in the air, hoping to disperse the crowd. However, the crowd became agitated and started pelting stones at the police. The police station was set on fire by the people, and all the policemen and officials inside were burned to death. That is when Gandhi withdrew the movement on 12th February 1921, because he felt that the people were not ready for a non-violent movement. Now let me introduce Jawaharlal Nehru into the picture. As we know, he studied law in England and he returned to India in 1912. Nehru joined the Indian National Congress in 1919. He was heavily influenced by Gandhi, who was the central figure of the Congress at that time. By the way, in the year 1919, Motilal Nehru, Jawaharlal Nehru's father, was the president of the Indian National Congress. Even his father was influenced by Gandhi's lifestyle, that Motilal Nehru, in spite of being rich, he became one of the first to transform his life to exclude Western clothes and material goods, adopting a more native Indian lifestyle. Anyhow, his son Jawaharlal Nehru joined the Congress in 1919 after the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. During the non-cooperation movement, led by Mahatma Gandhi, Nehru was imprisoned for the first time for activities against the British government. Jawaharlal Nehru became the General Secretary of the All India Congress Committee in September 1923. In the mid of 1920s, he went to many foreign countries like Italy, Switzerland, England, Belgium, Germany and Russia to study the idea of socialism. That's how he got inspired by the Soviet Union. And after independence, when Nehru became the first Prime Minister of India, he introduced socialism to independent India. Anyhow, that was a brief introduction of Jawaharlal Nehru. He came into the limelight at the end of 1920s, about which we will learn as we go ahead. In 1924, Gandhi became the president of the Indian National Congress. As we know, the non-cooperation movement failed. Hence, there was no noise and action in political activities. In 1927, the British government wanted a report on political reforms in India and on amending the Government of India Act 1919. This was actually part of the Government of India Act 1919. One of the provisions was that after 10 years, a statutory commission would be set up to study the working of the government. So the UK Parliament appointed a commission. The commission consisted of Sir John Simon and 6 other members. All of them were members of the British Parliament. There was not a single Indian as a member. It was composed solely of white people. The commission was an insult to Indians. These white men were to shape the future of India. Now this commission was supposed to be set up after 10 years from 1919. That means it was supposed to arrive in 1929. But then it came a year before because the UK government was led by the Conservative Party and they were scared of being defeated by the Labour Party in the upcoming elections. That is why they were in a hurry in appointing a commission in 1928. It was named after its chairman, Sir John Simon. The commission was composed entirely of British members, with not a single Indian member in it. Indians were outraged at their exclusion from the commission. If you remember, the Congress did not support the Government of India Act 1919. The commission was strongly opposed by many Indians. It was opposed by Nehru, Gandhi, Jinnah, the Muslim League and the Indian National Congress because it contained 7 members of the British Parliament but no Indians. By the way, the Muslim League was split on this issue. Jinnah, along with majority of the Muslim League leaders, boycotted the Simon Commission. A certain section of members in the Muslim League, led by Muhammad Shafi, supported the Simon Commission. When the 7 MPs arrived in Lahore on 30th October 1928, there was a mass protest, hartals and black flag demonstration all over the country. People were chanting the slogan, "Simon go back." The police resorted to lathi charges to suppress the movement. Even senior leaders like Jawaharlal Nehru were not spared. In Lahore, Lala Lajpat Rai, who was known as the Lion of Punjab, he was leading the demonstration against the Simon Commission. He was brutally lathi charged. He died on 17 November 1928 due to injuries. Before the arrival of Simon Commission, as we know, Indians were angry because there was not even a single Indian in the commission. So the Secretary of State for India, Lord Birkenhead, challenged the Indian leaders to draft a constitution for India. He basically taunted that Indians were not capable of finding a common path and drafting a constitution. The political leaders accepted this challenge and an all-party conference was held and a committee was appointed with the task of drafting a constitution. This committee was headed by Motilal Nehru, with Jawaharlal Nehru as the secretary. Other members were Ali Imam, Tej Bahadur Sapru, Mangal Singh, M.S. Annie, Subhash Chandra Bose, Shoaib Qureshi and Jia Pradhan. This draft constitution prepared by the committee was called the Nehru Committee or Nehru Report. It was drafted on August 28, 1928. Here are the recommendations of the report. Even Jinnah proposed some amendments on the Nehru's report. He proposed 14 points for safeguarding the rights and interests of the Muslims in any further constitution of the country. Here are the 14 points. He proposed these points during the December 1928 all-parties meeting. Now, if you draw a comparison of the Nehru report with Jinnah's 14 points, it had a political gap between the Muslims and the Hindus in India. Jinnah's aim was to get more rights for Muslims. It was basically a constitutional reform plan to safeguard the political rights of Muslims in self-governing India. So it is obvious that Jinnah was part of the Muslim League, so he had to take the side of the Muslims. From here on, you will gradually see that the Hindu-Muslim unity is fading away. So as we know, Lala Lajpat Rai died on 17 November 1928. Next month, that is on December 17, 1928, Bhagat Singh, Rajguru and Sukhdev shot dead J.P. Saunders, who was the Assistant Superintendent of Police outside the Superintendent's office in Lahore. Lala Lajpat Rai was Bhagat Singh's mentor. Many prominent leaders and politicians distanced themselves from Bhagat Singh. They even described it as a terrorist act. The British were looking for Bhagat Singh, so he had to be underground for a while. On April 8, 1929, Bhagat Singh resurfaced. He and Batukeshwar Dutt exploded 2 improvised bombs inside the Central Legislative Assembly in Delhi. They showered leaflets from the gallery on the legislators below, shouted slogans, and then allowed the authorities to arrest them. Their reasoning behind this courageous act was to inspire Indian people. It was an act that would make the deaf hear. Now the year 1929 is very interesting. Pay attention. So Bhagat Singh was arrested for killing a police officer. He was getting a lot of attention from the Indian people for his actions of bombing the assembly and then surrendering himself. And we all know Gandhi represented non-violence. So many historians say that around this time, Bhagat Singh's popularity was competing with the popularity of Gandhi. In the meantime, the Indian National Congress was also experiencing a transition. A new cadre of leadership, led by Jawaharlal Nehru and Subhash Chandra Bose, was emerging. Congress had 2 options in front of them. One option before the Congress was to demand a dominion status, for example like Canada and Australia, under which India would have still remained at least nominally under the British rule. And the second option was to demand for Purna Swaraj, which means full independence. Now, due to the rise of Bhagat Singh's popularity, the Congress started losing its influence over the youth, who were inspired by Bhagat Singh's act. There was a famous slogan used by Bhagat Singh, Inqilab Zindabad. Now this slogan started replacing the slogan of Vande Mataram, which was popularized by the Congress. So you can imagine the weight of Bhagat Singh's action. The older leadership in Congress were not in favor of this new voice. When I say older leadership, I mean Motilal Nehru and Gandhi. Jawaharlal Nehru had to convince the senior leadership of the Congress to change their agenda, otherwise they will risk losing their support to the extremist organizations. Then in the month of September 1929, Jawaharlal Nehru, backed by his father and Gandhi, was chosen as the new Congress president. As I said, the Congress had 2 options, either to choose dominion status or demand full independence. On December 19, 1929, the Indian National Congress declared Purna Swaraj as its goal in its Lahore session. Before 1920, it was just Swaraj, that is self-rule. Now it is about Purna Swaraj, that means complete independence from the British. If you see, somewhere Bhagat Singh's actions boosted the Congress and its newly elected president Jawaharlal Nehru's popularity. In other words, Jawaharlal Nehru capitalized on Bhagat Singh's popularity. If you see, Jawaharlal Nehru's role was secondary before becoming the president of the Indian National Congress in 1929. Now he is the central figure. So the rise of Jawaharlal Nehru started after the Simon Commission of 1928. Purna Swaraj was a document created by the Indian National Congress, which was basically like a constitution only. Nehru hoisted the newly adopted tricolour flag of India on 26 January 1930 on the banks of River Ravi in Lahore. The objective behind this resolution was to get complete freedom from the British. And as we all know, 26 January from there on was celebrated as Republic Day in India. Bhagat Singh, Rajguru and Sukhdev were executed on March 23, 1931, a little more than a year after the Congress called for Purna Swaraj. Many people think how things would have turned out if Bhagat Singh had not surrendered, because he really captured the imagination of the people, and somewhere his popularity helped Jawaharlal Nehru to rise so quickly to the top in the Congress. Now let's introduce Subhash Chandra Bose. As I said, a new cadre of leadership led by Jawaharlal Nehru and Subhash Chandra Bose was emerging in the late 1920s. Bose was a leader of the younger radical wing of the Indian National Congress. He joined the Indian National Congress Youth Wing in 1921. He also started a newspaper called Swaraj. He was the president of the All India Youth Congress and also the secretary of the Bengal State Congress. In 1924, he became the CEO of the Calcutta Municipal Corporation. Bose was sent to prison in Mandalay for nationalist activities in 1925. He was released in 1927 and became the Indian National Congress's General Secretary. He worked with Jawaharlal Nehru and the two became the Congress Party's young leaders, gaining popularity among the people. In 1930, he became the mayor of Calcutta. He was also elected as the president of Congress in 1939, but he resigned due to differences with Gandhi's supporters. He had differences with Gandhi and he was not a believer of non-violence as a tool for independence. So anyhow, he left the Congress in 1939. We will learn more on him as we go ahead with the timeline. So anyhow, let's get back to 1930. Jawaharlal Nehru hoisted the newly adopted tricolour flag of India on 26 January 1930 on the banks of River Ravi in Lahore. The objective behind this event was to get complete freedom from British. It's called Purna Swaraj. The party's agenda is fixed. Now they needed a plan to achieve it. It was decided that civil disobedience movement is the way to achieve Purna Swaraj. As usual, Gandhi was the man who was asked to plan and organize the act. Now to create a movement, you need a problem, a situation. Gandhi chose to break the salt tax that the British government had imposed. In his opinion, tax on salt was the most oppressive form of tax. As you know, salt is a basic necessity for humans. Gandhi started the Dandi March on 12th March 1930 from Sabarmati Ashram in Gujarat towards coastal village of Dandi. This whole march was about 390 km in distance. Gandhi and his followers started the march. They covered the entire length in 25 days. On 6th April 1930, they reached the coast of Dandi, and by picking up a handful of salt, Gandhi broke the salt laws and launched the mass civil disobedience movement. Even Sarojini Naidu was part of the Dandi March. This movement was a non-violent protest. It made way for many other peaceful protests against other kinds of oppressions that were going on all over the country. I want you to understand the weight of this civil disobedience movement. In Bihar, anti-Chaukidar tax campaign was initiated. In Gujarat, a no-tax movement took place against the payment of land revenue. In Maharashtra, Karnataka and central provinces, defiance of forest laws took place on a large scale. In Assam, a powerful agitation led by students was launched against the Cunningham Circular. In United Province, a no revenue, no rent campaign was organized against the government, which soon turned into a no rent campaign against the zamindars. So you see, Gandhi's civil disobedience movement gave a boost to many other movements across the country. And there were many Indians who hated Gandhi because their businesses were ruined due to these protests. I'm talking about the Indian zamindars, businesses and shop owners. Now during this time, the Governor General and Viceroy was Lord Irwin. In July 1930, the Viceroy suggested a roundtable conference. There were three reasons behind it. One, there was a nationwide boycott of British goods due to civil disobedience movement and it was hurting their business. Two, in UK, the Labour government had come to power and there was inadequacy in the Salmon Commission's report. And three, Muhammad Ali Jinnah had personally recommended this roundtable conference to Lord Irwin. The first roundtable conference took place from 12th November 1930 to 19 January 1931. Congress was not part of it because most of their leaders, including Gandhi, were in jail due to the civil disobedience movement. but representatives of all other Indian parties and number of princes participated. There were 58 political leaders from India and 16 delegates from the princely states. In total, 74 delegates from India attended the conference, but Congress was not part of it. Among the British Indians, the following representatives attended the conference: Muslim League, Hindus, Justice Party, Sikhs, Liberals, Parsis, Christians, Anglo-Indians, Europeans, landlords, Labour, women, universities, Sindh, Burma, other provinces, and the representatives from the Government of India. Now here are some of the issues discussed in the first roundtable conference. Although many principles on reforms were agreed upon, not much was implemented, and the Congress Party carried on its civil disobedience movement. The conference was regarded as a failure, and the British government understood the importance and the need for the Congress Party to make any decision on India's political future. So that is where the weight of the Indian National Congress increased in the eyes of the British. As I have told you, many Congress leaders including Gandhi were arrested for carrying out the civil disobedience movement. They all were released from jail on January 25th, 1931. The Congress Working Committee told Gandhi to initiate discussions with the Viceroy Lord Irwin. On 5th March 1931, a pact was signed in Delhi, which came to be known as Delhi Pact or Gandhi-Irwin Pact. So basically, Gandhi-Irwin Pact is the name given to a political agreement between Gandhi and Lord Irwin. In 1930, the Salt Satyagraha was conducted. India and Gandhi received worldwide attention. The British government in India was criticized for its unjust treatment of Indians. Lord Irwin wanted this issue to come to an end. That is why Gandhi was released from prison in January 1931. The Congress president, Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, asked Gandhi to hold talks with Lord Irwin. The next roundtable conference took place on 7th November 1931. Viceroy Irwin requested Gandhi to attend the conference. He was the sole representative of the Congress. The Sikh, Muslim, Christians representatives wanted to safeguard their interests. Gandhi presented some of his demands. Few of them were passed, but the British government refused to entertain Gandhi's basic question of India's freedom. From the Congress viewpoint, the second roundtable conference ended in failure. Gandhi was disappointed. He came back to India on 29th December 1931 and resumed the civil disobedience movement. He was again arrested along with other Congress leaders. Because the plan of the British government was not to allow Gandhi and the Congress to build up the momentum of the civil disobedience movement, so the movement was effectively crushed within a few months. It is also said that 2 weeks before the second roundtable conference started, the Labour government in the UK had been replaced by the Conservatives. Now, whenever the Conservatives came in power, they were not at all interested in leaving India, because India was their biggest cash cow. So they were against the idea of Purna Swaraj that the Congress rallied on. Anyhow, the third and the last session of the Roundtable Conference took place between November 17, 1932 and 24 December 1932. Only 46 delegates attended since most of the main political figures of India were not present. The Labour Party from Britain and the Indian National Congress refused to attend. So there was no meaning behind the third Roundtable Conference. It was just for namesake. Now all the things that were discussed and suggested from 1930 to 1933 in the name of Roundtable Conferences and the Simon Commission Report of 1930 were finally seen in the Government of India Act 1935. Before the beginning of the third Roundtable Conference, in the month of September 1932, the Pune Pact was signed between the Congress and B.R. Ambedkar. So Madan Mohan Malviya was the president of the Congress Party in 1932. He represented most of the Hindus and the Congress Party. On the other side, B.R. Ambedkar represented the depressed classes. In the second Roundtable Conference, B.R. Ambedkar demanded separate electorate for depressed classes or untouchables who are called scheduled castes today. Gandhi was against it. That is why he had clashes with Ambedkar. Although the British government fulfilled the demand of Ambedkar by giving separate electorates for depressed classes on August 15, 1932, but after signing the Pune Pact on 24th September 1932, instead of the 80 seats given by the British, the depressed classes got 148 seats. Madan Mohan Malviya signed the Pune Pact on behalf of Hindus and Gandhi, and Ambedkar on behalf of depressed classes. One thing we have to understand is that the civil disobedience movement led by Gandhi saw limited participation of Dalits. Somewhere the depressed classes were not moved by the concept of Swaraj. On the other hand, Gandhi wanted the upper caste to change their hearts towards the Dalits and give up the practice of untouchability. But Ambedkar's point of view was different. He saw the Dalit question as a political issue and not a social issue. That is why he was very adamant in demanding separate electorate for Dalits. But Gandhi said that separate electorate will create division among Hindus so much that it will lead to bloodshed. If you can recollect, the Government of India Act 1919 introduced the principle of communal representation by providing separate electorates for non-Brahmin groups, Sikh, Indian Christians, Anglo-Indians and Europeans. And the Indian Council Act of 1909 provided reserved seats for Muslims in the Imperial Legislative Council. So you see how the British created a split in the Indian society. So anyhow, the Pune Pact of 1932 was signed between Ambedkar and the Indian National Congress, which included Gandhi's consent too. In other words, Gandhi had to compromise with Ambedkar. On 6th March 1934, the Reserve Bank of India Act was passed, under which the Reserve Bank of India was formed. On 24 July 1935, the Government of India Act was passed by the British government. As I've told you, all the things that were discussed and suggested from 1930 to 1933 in the name of roundtable conferences and the Simon Commission report of 1930 were finally seen in the Government of India Act 1935. The Government of India Act 1935 was replaced by the Constitution of India after independence. The Indian leaders were not enthusiastic about this act, since despite granting provincial autonomy, the governors and the viceroy had many special powers. Then separate communal electorates were a measure through which the British continued the divide and rule policy and ensured the Congress party could never rule on its own. After the end of the civil disobedience movement around 1934, Gandhi temporarily withdrew from active politics. There was a small divide within the Congress. That's how in May 1934, Congress Socialist Party was formed. In 1936, majority of the Congress leaders, led by Rajendra Prasad and Vallabhbhai Patel, with blessing of Gandhi, decided to contest the provincial elections under the new Act of 1935. As per the Government of India Act 1935, it introduced direct elections in India for the first time. So provincial elections were held in British India in the winter of 1936. Elections were held in 11 provinces. They were Madras, Central Provinces, Bihar, Orissa, United Provinces, Bombay Presidency, Assam, Northwestern Frontier Province, Bengal, Punjab and Sindh. The 1937 election was the first in which large number of Indians were eligible to participate. Approximately 30 million people voted. Here are the results. And by the way, during this time, the Congress president was Jawaharlal Nehru. So he became the face of the winning party. As we know, elections were held in 11 provinces. Out of these 11 provinces, the Indian National Congress won in 8. The 3 provinces where they could not form the government were Bengal, Punjab and Sindh. On the other hand, the All India Muslim League failed to form the government in any province. And that's when the Congress rule first began in British India from 1937 to 1939. Muslim League started attacking the Congress regarding its insensitivity towards Muslim culture. Viceroy Lingletgo declared India at war with Nazi Germany on 3rd September 1939. As you know, the Second World War started in September 1939. The British government, without consulting the Indian leaders, who were just elected in previous election, declared India at war with Nazi Germany. The British government thought that if India supported in 1914 World War I, it was natural that India would do it again. But if you remember, during 1914, India supported the British in the World War I, but they were expecting Swaraj in return. And you also know the British disappointed the Indians. But this time the Indian National Congress demanded independence before. Only then it would help Britain. On the other hand, the Muslim League under the leadership of Jinnah promised to support the British in the war. Anyhow, Viceroy refused the demands of the Congress. On 22nd October 1939, all Congress ministries were called upon to tender their resignation. Both Viceroy Lingletgo and Muhammad Ali Jinnah were pleased with the resignations. The day when all the Congress ministries in the provinces resigned, the Muslim League were very pleased with it. They even observed December 23rd, 1939 as the Deliverance Day. By 1940, Jinnah and the Muslim League had come to believe that Muslims of the Indian subcontinent should have their own state. On March 21st, 1940, Muslim League ultimately came forward for the formation of independent state of Pakistan, making it the homeland of the Muslims. It was in this year that two-nation theory was introduced and Pakistan Resolution was passed. It is also called Lahore Resolution. It is also said that the idea of two-nation theory emerged in 1920 when the Aligarh Muslim University was formed, but officially it was rolled out in the form of Pakistan Resolution or Lahore Resolution in 1940. So anyhow, on 22nd October 1939, all Congress ministries resigned from the provincial assemblies for not supporting the British in World War II. As we know that the World War II was fought between the Axis powers, which included countries like Germany, Italy and Japan. They were fighting against the Allies, which consisted of France, Great Britain, the United States, the Soviet Union, and to a lesser extent China. Initially, the Allies were suffering a lot in the war. Even Britain herself was in danger of being occupied by the Nazis. The British government was desperate to get Indian support for the war. That is when in the year 1940, Viceroy Linlithgow made a set of proposals called the August Offer. Here are the terms of the August Offer. For the first time, the right of Indians to frame their own constitution was acknowledged. But the Indian National Congress rejected this offer and demanded complete freedom from colonial rule. Even the Muslim League rejected the August Offer. They were interested in the partition of the country. So anyhow, it was only after the August Offer, Gandhi initiated the individual satyagraha to affirm the right to free speech. He avoided a mass satyagraha because he did not want violence. The people who participated were called satyagrahis. Many of them were jailed. As I said, the British were desperate to get Indian support for the war. Now, after the failure of the August Offer, the British government sent the Cripps mission to India in late March 1942 to get the Indian support for the war. The mission was headed by a senior minister, Sir Stafford Cripps. Cripps was sent to India to negotiate with the Indian National Congress leaders. Most of these leaders represented the majority Hindu population and the Muslim League, who represented minority Muslim population. Cripps said that the British government is willing to offer India a complete dominion status once the war was over. Dominion status means semi-independence from the British Crown, for example Canada and Australia. Anyhow, that was the whole proposal presented to the Indian leaders by Sir Stafford Cripps. Both the major parties, that is the Indian National Congress and the Muslim League, rejected this proposal because they knew that the ball was in their court and they cannot trust the British anymore. With this, the Cripps mission was a failed attempt by the British government to secure Indian cooperation in World War II. In the same year, on 8th August 1942, Gandhi launched the Quit India movement. It was a non-violent civil disobedience movement launched after the failure of Cripps' mission. If you can recollect, during the World War I in 1914, there were many people in India who had the opinion that if Britain got involved in a crisis somewhere, something like a world war, then the Indian extremists would use this as an opportunity to advance the idea of self-government. Although the opposite happened, the Indian leaders went on to support Britain in World War I and expected a reward from the British government. The British government hugely disappointed the Indian people after World War I. So this time during World War II, the Congress leaders did not repeat the same mistake. They refused to support Britain. Instead, the Quit India movement was launched. However, almost the entire leadership of the Indian National Congress was imprisoned without trial within hours of Gandhi's speech. Most of them spent the rest of the war in prison and out of contact with the masses. The British had the support of the Viceroy's Council, which had a majority of Indians like the All India Muslim League, the Princely States, the Indian Imperial Police, the British Indian Army, the Hindu Mahasabha and the Indian Civil Service. The British were able to take control of India mainly because India was not united. The British signed treaties and made military and trading alliances with many of the independent states. There were many Indian businessmen who were profiting from heavy wartime spending. Naturally, they did not support the Quit India movement. As a ruler of a princely state, you could not grant any political rights or allow the feeling of nationalism get into the minds of the people of your kingdom. that would cause rebellion, so they had to keep their kingdoms unexposed from these nationalist movements. And if you see, it was in the ruler's best interest. So naturally, many of the rulers of princely states did not support the Quit India movement. At that time, there were almost 600 princely states. So even if the British government did not receive any political support from its own controlled provinces, the British had enough support from the subcontinent. And then if you pay attention to Subhash Chandra Bose, he was in Germany. He even met Hitler and asked his help to support the cause of India's liberation from British rule. So what I'm trying to say is, if you look at the Indian political struggle only from the Congress party's point of view, then you also have to put it in right context. They were very much part of the freedom struggle. However, if you think that the British left India simply because of Mahatma Gandhi's non-violent movements and the political smartness of the Indian National Congress, that is also not fully true. As I've told you, many of the Indian people were against India's civil disobedience movement. And then if you look at it from international level, no country in the world was supporting India from outside. I think the only outside support came from the Americans, when President Roosevelt told Prime Minister Winston Churchill during World War II to give in to some of the Indians' demands, which was not even that effective. Even the Quit India movement was crushed by the British. So all the notion that British left India simply because of Gandhi's non-violent movements and the smartness of Indian National Congress is not fully true. And this is where Subhash Chandra Bose played an important role from outside India. But most of his contribution is ignored from our school history books. When Bose met Hitler in May 1942, Bose was in Germany from April 1941 to February 1943. The reason he went to Germany was because he had this concept that your enemy's enemy is your friend. And we know that Britain was fighting with Nazi Germany in World War II from 1939 to 1945. So he looked at Nazi Germany as an ally. Anyhow, there's a long story behind that. What you need to know is that the World War II was fought between the Axis powers, which included countries like Germany, Italy and Japan. They were fighting against the Allies, which consisted of France, Great Britain, the United States, the Soviet Union, and to a lesser extent China. When Bose arrived in Germany, he realized that Germany was busy forming fighting strategies against the Soviet Union. When Japan declared war against Great Britain and the US on December 7, 1941, the Japanese army was advancing towards the Indian frontier from the northeastern side, basically from the Burma side. Bose left from Germany to Japan towards the end of 1942. By then, Imperial Japan had conquered Burma. Tens of thousands of Indian Jawans were held as prisoners of war by the Japanese army. Bose wanted to make an army with the help of these captured Indian Jawans, and that was the reason behind his journey to Japan. You see, Subhash Chandra Bose played an important role in getting India freedom. So if you simply think that British left India because of Mahatma Gandhi's non-violent movement and the political smartness of the Indian National Congress leaders, that is not fully true. In fact, there is a conversation between the former British Prime Minister Clement Attlee and the then Governor of West Bengal, Justice P.V. Chakrabarty. Clement Attlee was the Prime Minister of UK during the time between 1945 to 1951, when India got independence. In that conversation, Attlee said, "It was a result of the military activities of Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose that compelled the British to leave India." And he also said that Gandhi's influence upon the British decision to quit India was minimal. I'm not trying to disrespect the Indian National Congress and Mahatma Gandhi for their political efforts and also their feelings and emotion towards the people of India in every mass movement that they created were genuine. But if you look at most of Indian history textbook about the freedom struggle, they are dominated by the role played by the non-violent movement of Mahatma Gandhi, Ahimsa and Satyagraha. But you have to understand the fact that India's freedom was not gained entirely by the non-violent struggle of Mahatma Gandhi. It also had the contribution of force imposed by Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose. Let's get back to the timeline. In August 1942, the Indian National Army was formed. It is also called Azad Hind Fauj. It consisted of British Indian soldiers who were captured by Japan. Indian National Army was formed with the help of Imperial Japan, and its aim was to secure independence for India from British rule. Although the army was formed under Mohan Singh, it was later on handed over to Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose. In 1943, the Bengal famine killed up to 4 million people. The main reason behind this famine is due to Winston Churchill's policy failure. Winston Churchill was the Prime Minister in UK during the World War II. He belonged to the Conservative Party, and I've already said whenever the Conservatives come in power, they were not at all interested in leaving India because India was the biggest cash cow for them. If you have watched Shashi Tharoor's video, Does Britain Owes Reparations, in that he has said it was because of Winston Churchill's policy failure that caused the Bengal famine. He diverted the supplies of rice from the coastal areas of Bengal to Europeans as reserve stockpiles. We know that the Quit India movement was started in August 1942. After that, almost entire leadership of the Indian National Congress, including Gandhi, was imprisoned. They were cut off from the rest of the world for over 3 years. Most Congress leaders were kept in prison till 1945. That is when the World War II ended. But Gandhi was released in 1944. In the same year, his wife Kasturba Gandhi died. During this time, the Governor General and Viceroy was Lord Wavell. On 25th June 1945, there was a meeting between the Viceroy Lord Wavell and all major political leaders of British India, including Gandhi and Jinnah, in Shimla, which came to be known as Shimla Conference of 1945. The aim of this conference was to make a plan for Indian self-government. Now, the Muslim League and the Indian National Congress were not coming to an agreement. The conference was a failure because the Muslim League and the Congress could not settle their differences. After this, the World War II ended and a new Labour government was elected in Britain. This new government was keen on giving independence to India without much delay and sent the cabinet mission with that purpose. At this time, Clement Attlee was the Prime Minister of UK. He decided to send a mission to India for the transfer of powers from the British Indian government to Indian leaders. The mission had 3 British cabinet members, Pethick Lawrence, Stafford Cripps, and A.V. Alexander. The main objective of cabinet mission was the transfer of power from the British Indian government to Indian leaders by framing a constitution and set up an interim government. Even the cabinet mission failed because the Muslim League and the Congress could not settle their differences. Both parties had many ideological differences and could not find common ground. Since the plan was not accepted, a new plan was proposed by the mission in June 1946. This plan proposed the division of India into a Hindu majority India and a Muslim majority India, later to be renamed Pakistan. A list of princely states was also made that could either join the Union or remain independent. The Congress party under Jawaharlal Nehru did not accept the second plan, but he agreed to be part of the Constituent Assembly. The Viceroy invited 14 men to form the interim government. There were 5 from the Congress, 5 from the League, 1 member each representing the Sikh, Parsi, Indian Christian and scheduled caste communities. Nehru headed the interim government. The new government began the task of framing a constitution for the country. Congress-led governments were formed in most provinces, including the Northwestern Frontier Province. In Bengal and Sindh, the League formed the governments. Jinnah and the League objected to the new central government. Jinnah geared to agitate for Pakistan and urged Muslims to demand Pakistan by any means. He called for a Direct Action Day on 16th August 1946. Direct Action Day was a large-scale rioting in Calcutta. There was a massive communal bloodshed between Hindus and Muslims in Calcutta. This riot had spread till Punjab and in northwestern frontier provinces. Many people died. When all of this was happening, the British government did not do anything to stop this riot. It was as if the British government were laughing, looking at Indian Muslims and Hindus killing each other. All this bloodshed and communal tension ultimately led to the Congress's acceptance of the partition of the country in order to stop the violence and bloodbath. In the middle of all these communal riots, on 21st February 1947, Lord Mountbatten arrived in India as the last Viceroy of India. On 3rd June 1947, Mountbatten proposed the partition plan to divide British India into independent dominions of India and Pakistan. It was also known as the Mountbatten Plan. In the month of August 1947, the leaders of the Muslim League and Indian National Congress formally communicated their acceptance of the plan for the partition of the subcontinent into Pakistan and India. Gandhi was against the partition of India. He was very much distressed and advised people not to accept partition by heart. But things had gone way ahead, so Gandhi had to forcefully accept it. From 11th August 1947, To 13th August 1947, partition violence erupted in Sialkot and drove the surviving Hindus and Sikh to Jammu. All the Hindus and Sikh who lived in Sialkot region fled to Jammu. On 14th August 1947, Pakistan was created with Muhammad Ali Jinnah as their Governor General. And on 15th August 1947, the British government transferred the power of India into the hands of Indian National Congress, with Jawaharlal Nehru as the first Prime Minister. As I've told you in the beginning, partition happened only of the British-controlled provinces. That meant after 15th August 1947, the princely states would be completely independent, and they would not receive any form of help or support from the Government of India for defense, finance and other infrastructure. Now these independent princely states had two options, either to join India or to join Pakistan. Many say that there was also an option to remain independent, but then you need to understand that most of these princely states were landlocked entities and were functioning with huge support from the British government. Now that the British government were no longer there, someday they had to merge with India for administration support. And the British knew this. In fact, they wanted to look good while advising these rulers to accede with India or Pakistan, because then they can tell the whole world that they helped India become unified. With this, we have come to an end of this video. There's another part of this video where I have covered the modern history from 1600 to 1857, and in this video from 1857 to 1947. So together it wraps up the entire modern history of India. I hope you found this video informative. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section, and thanks for watching it.